So that's right, folks, only 3 days are left between us and the Path of Exile to early access, and the good news keeps on coming. A new pre-download client for the PC just got announced. We also got some more info on the server capacity on day 1 and many more details on the endgame. Plus, Pinnacle bosses may end up being even more challenging than we initially thought. So lots to discuss in this video, and by the way, you still have time to enter my giveaway for the 2 early access keys. You just have to be a sub to the channel, leave a like on the video, and also comment down below. But to get started, we have the pre-downloads, and this has been so massively requested by the fan base that Grinding Gears is now putting out a standalone PC client that's going to be available to download starting on Thursday, December 5th, from 5 p.m. PST, but you can also see the time conversion right here on the website to your local time. I'm going to post the links down below for you to follow, by the way. But please note that when patching begins for Path of Exile to early access, you may also have a few remaining files that you will need to update as well. And you can download the client, by the way, directly from the main Path of Exile 2 website. However, there's also going to be a torrent that you can download with the client directly, and in case that doesn't work from the website, you have this additional means. For other platforms, good to note is that Xbox pre-downloads have already begun. Meanwhile, for the PlayStation, Founders Pack should go live 24 hours ahead of the early access, which is going to give you plenty of time to download the game and get yourself ready. Do keep in mind, however, that after downloading the client, you won't be able to log in until EA starts at 11 a.m. PST on Friday, December 6th. So yeah, it's very interesting to see it because initially Grinding Gears didn't want to release any PC client to avoid any data mining or any spoilers, but it seems that the community feedback was just way too great. In the meantime, however, we do have this almost 2-hour interview with the game's director posted on the Zizaren channel, so you can go ahead and check him out. Obviously, if you haven't seen it, there are some big key takeaways here that stood out with me. So I do want to cover them, starting with the Pinnacle bosses. So a big question here was, do we have one or do we have multiple attempts for each Pinnacle boss? To which the answer was, at least for the time being, we only get one death for each Pinnacle boss attempt. So that means if you fail it, you're going to have to restart from the very beginning and basically just have to wait for the encounter or the next opportunity you have to do the encounter again. Which also raises a few concerns within the fan base. Mainly, it's going to make it much more difficult to do practice runs now, learning the boss mechanics on your own, and instead you're going to be forced to maybe watch online video guides so that you don't waste your own attempts. At the same time, this also means we're going to have to focus a lot more on our gear and really go in locked in and well prepared. Not just in terms of damage, but maybe also like going on with a lot more defenses, which on one side I can totally see the appeal of. I definitely think that that's like the better approach, like really go in and only have that one chance, but I can also see the more casual players maybe not loving this as much and maybe even holding off from doing Pinnacle bosses entirely. But from the way it was worded, the game's director seemed open to feedback, so only for the time being is it that this change is being implemented, and it's maybe likely that in the future we're going to see multiple attempts being added for Pinnacle bosses. And one suggestion I really liked was one in which we have multiple portals, but every time we die and use one again, it's going to reset that boss back to 100% HP rather than continuing from where it was left off to avoid cheesing it, which I totally think is like the best and most sensible middle ground between all of this. However, there are some other things that will help us in the Pinnacle boss fights. Obviously, we cannot use portals during it, but we can still use the restart to checkpoint from the pause menu, so we can press escape and just use restart to checkpoint, and this is going to bring us to the previous checkpoint before the boss fight. Or Alt F4 does the same thing, exiting the client in any way also does that. Now, Jonathan also talked about a very interesting feature that may help to not die from lag spikes, especially on hardcore difficulty. So he's not 100% sure if it's been completely implemented just yet, but this feature is supposed to detect when you have internet lag. So when it's been over 100 milliseconds from when your client last responded to the server, and the server in this case will detect it and pause that game for you even if you did not completely disconnect. so that you do not die for no reason, which is actually a very good option. This is going to mean you're not going to die for so many reasons that are out of your control, like in this case having those lag spikes. Especially useful, I would say, on the hardcore difficulty, but even on like normal mode, this should make things like just better for everybody. In the meantime, let's also talk about some other stuff. Obviously, characters and databases are going to be separate from PoE 1 to PoE 2. So if you have a name that you really like, you're going to have to reclaim it again or hurry to do so in PoE 2. The databases do not get shared. In the meantime, I do want to talk about some of the other stuff over here. One of them is in regards to the towers / buffing of maps. So as you may or may not know, the Atlas is going to be one of the main endgame activities, and as we move through those maps to the next towers, we're going to eventually also find different activities like breaches and whatnot. Also ones making a return, by the way, from the first Path of Exile. But basically, these are also going to have a chance to drop tablets that we can then use at the towers to buff all the maps in the radius, both with modifiers but also with some of these new activities. And one of the questions was, well, because we have to run maps to reach the towers in the first place, we're effectively consuming some of the maps that we could have buffed with the tablets. Is there a way to work around that, or are the maps sufficient enough? And yes, because the radius is so large to these towers, the answer was that there are more than enough maps going around. And also when we apply those tablets, there's going to be at least 6 or 7 of them that will generally affect the radius around, on top of the fact that we can also stack multiple of these tablets if towers are close enough to one another. Generally, it means there will be more maps in the radius than the ones that you get to add. Now, on top of this, Jonathan also confirmed that towers can only be used once. So it seems that once you place a tablet in, the effect takes place immediately and you cannot change it, which means you're going to have to really make it count, really maximize those runs, especially in the case of overlapping towers. You really want to think about which tablet you add and stack with other tablets from nearby towers. For example, if you're running breaches and want to maximize the number of enemies, drops, and number of events, you're going to really want to use tablets that affect breaches. However, on the other hand, he also mentioned that we don't just have event tablets affecting these events like the breaches and the rituals and delirium and whatnot. We also have generic tablets that will affect all the maps with more general types of mods. So there's also like that upside over there, but they will still be gauging the long-term feel of the entire Atlas, and obviously there will be some heavy rebalances as we move further and further in the early access. So do expect a lot of rebalancing to be done to this feature. Obviously, with such an anticipated launch, we also have to talk about the player count. Now, if you have taken free time from work to play it on day one, maybe still expect that there may be longer queues or maybe even some issues with the logins, because this is a highly anticipated game. Now, despite all of this, Grinding Gears did mention that they are ready for about 1 million players in terms of server capacity on day one, with the possibility to increase that if needed, which is actually quite good to know. Yes, this is a very anticipated game, but Grinding Gears mentioned that they aren't expecting many more over 1 million, and even 1 million may be a little bit high for them. But again, the game has been pretty much breaking records. It's top sold on Steam, everybody's talking about it, and the views are really high. So obviously, lots of folks will jump in, maybe even exceeding that 1 million mark. Now, moving back to the gameplay, they've also talked about the rune system, replacing the crafting bench, and also a bunch of things that players have to be very worried about, but also a big advantage that early game players will get, specifically within like the first 40 levels or so. So one of them is that when you slot in runes on a gear piece, that's going to be a permanent thing. You cannot remove them once socketed, and you also cannot override them, which doesn't sound as bad as you think it does, given the fact that we can just salvage items with sockets on them, get the Artificer Orb, and just add new sockets to new gear. It only means that we're going to maybe have the chance of wasting potentially good gear pieces, which is why you're going to maybe want to be careful about that. But the later stages, it seems that's going to change. Early on, you're going to just run through new gear and constantly upgrading that. It seems, at least according to Grinding Gears, that's not going to be a problem. At least according to the interview, it seems that they are expecting for this upgrade system to be much more intuitive and maybe even easier than the one in Path of Exile 2, at least in reaching higher level powers. And I'm saying that because they've also talked about how strong these runes are in the early stages of the game. And that is because they have a fixed resistance value. I believe it was 15% from the looks of it, which at that stage in the early game is much higher than any other source. This also means that in the later stages, they will kind of taper off and become less useful, simply because you're going to get a lot more other mods and other means to fiddle with your build. And one of those options will also be the soul cores, which are basically the endgame versions of runes, much stronger, provide more effects, and still retain some of those resistances from the looks of it. But early on, these are going to be very strong. You can also easily apply them to gear via the artificer orbs, and you're constantly going to want to do that. But in the first stages, because of those fixed values, they will also feel very strong, at least for those 40 levels. Now, how rare are the rarest of runes? Well, not that rare actually. You can find 4 or 5 of them just in Act 1, and then by Act 3 you will generally have all the runes that you need. And then soul cores are going to be your kind of aspirational, not really aspirational, but like the end game content that you want to get. The higher level gameplay, this is where it's at. And there are soul cores in there on the level of rarity of divine and even eternal orbs from the interview. Now, there were a few more questions being asked, like, can you stack ailments? To which the answer was that in general they will not stack unless there's actually some kind of mechanic unlock, especially to your class mechanic or the skill tree. And they've also given an example on how stacking ailments of the same type works. So let's say, for example, you stack multiple poisons, well, the 2 strongest will apply first. And if there's more than 2, then the next strongest will apply after the first ones have expired, which is pretty self-explanatory. And also, does mana/elemental leech exist? Well, mana leech exists, but only for attacks, not for spells. Reason being is because they want spellcasting to follow its own set of rules and its own mechanics that you want to take advantage of, and mana leech on spell hits will kind of be detrimental to that. Also, in terms of elemental reach, this is going to be existing in the game, but it's going to be harder to obtain. However, there are various mechanics that may provide elemental reach, though they didn't go into much detail. Also, in terms of crit builds, in PoE 1, we had a lot of crit builds, and you were supposed to like get as close as possible to 100% crit. In PoE 2, that is still possible, but mechanics-wise, you may not find this as optimal in Path of Exile 2, because the best strategy in this case would be to focus on balancing the crit chance with other stats to enhance overall effectiveness. So total crit isn't necessarily the path to success in Path of Exile 2. Also, an interesting thing they mentioned on that suffixes on rare gear, which actually gets me really excited, is that at the super highest tier content, you can have rares dropping that may have no dash suffixes at all, and that is because they have tiered them in a way that, for example, certain suffixes will only go up to a certain eye level. So at the highest pinnacle content, when you get a rare, there's a possibility that because of its super high eye level, it's going to completely cut off any of those dead suffixes, and you're not going to see any of them even appearing on that gear, which is actually really awesome. It just means that you're going to maybe be able to get a much stronger build going. But yeah, Jonathan also mentioned that those rares are very rare and something that's extremely difficult to get. So yeah, obviously we're still going to have to fight through bad suffixes no matter what. Anyway, on a final note, I do have a few more things being answered. One is in regards to respecking, especially in the early access when big change patches come in. And for the ones that make huge global changes, like for example, really nerfing a build that maybe you have invested a ton of points into, you will have a free respec. Also good to know that in Path of Exile 2, we are only going to do that with gold, by the way. Also, in terms of respecking, no news on respecking Ascendecies, for example. Unfortunate, but that's at least what they're planning in the first stages of the early access. However, they don't want to like talk too much about if there's going to be respecking of Ascendecies in the future. And finally, in terms of playing hardcore and pausing, currently in terms of accepting invites when, for example, things get tough and you want to maybe get a friend in, you cannot really accept invites when you pause the game. However, you can by just quickly pausing, getting the invite, quickly unpausing to accept it, and then pausing again so that you don't die in case you're in a struggle. But they've also talked about a feature that they want to implement at some point in which we can pause the game but still have the possibility to look at the rest of the interface, maybe even interact with certain things when paused, such as, for example, I don't know, the character screen. Unfortunately, they didn't get to do that just yet. In any case, you're going to find some links down below for all of this. It looks really exciting, so I cannot wait for the next 3 days. Again, if you're also excited and maybe don't get a chance to get a code, you can totally also subscribe and take part in my giveaway. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.